It's March 20th, 1996, and this is the 8th Principles of the Infinite Way class. So let's begin. Good evening, everybody.
Hello.
So we are tonight at the center of the nature of the mind, which I'm sure is the center of the class, although not in weeks, but this is the turning point. Everything for the previous 6 weeks was leading up to the last week's material, and we really said all the facts about the mind last week, but it's a lot of material, and it needs to really sink in. Then from here we'll go on and we'll do the nature of supply and the nature of healing, but as we'll see, that's really just a matter of saying a few things which are a natural outgrowth from the nature of the mind. This nature of the mind is really how it works. And I want to spend all of this evening still on the nature of the mind, a little bit of review, and then I want to read from Meg Johnson's tape. I transcribed her tape, and I just want to read that a paragraph at a time and hold an open forum on that to make sure that anybody can ask any questions they want to and understand what she's saying. As usual, it's not open for discussion whether it's true or not, but it is open for discussion what it is she's saying and to make sure we understand it. We talked about the actually four parts of the mind: consciousness, and God, of course, is everyone's individual consciousness. And consciousness is the creative principle. And we talked about the mind, and the mind forms. The mind is an instrument which consciousness uses. You can think of it this way. You can think of the mind as an instrument that consciousness uses to reflect back to it its own content. Not unlike a mirror is an instrument that we use to stand in front of and see how we look. Similarly, when you look out into the world, what you are seeing is a reflection of your consciousness as formed by mind. Mind has no choice about the matter. Mind has no will. Mind forms whatever is in consciousness. So then there's the intellect. And the intellect really there's two sides to it. The intellect, we really should, maybe another time we'll get a couple of words for intellect, because we're starting now to get one word for each function, and we really need another word for that. Intellect, first of all, is the storehouse of all the human experience. And that's all your human experience for all your lifetimes, and that's also the collective human experience. So the intellect is that huge database of conditioning. And it's also if you want to think of it this way, it's the place that the consciousness resides when we're living in the 3D world. Before we start remembering who we are and start contacting the 4D world and start having God consciousness and realization of God and realization of love and truth, we're totally locked up in the 3D intellect, and the 3D intellect is the one that sits there and bombards us with all this rational, logical shoulds and shouldn't stuff that our mothers taught us, and their mothers taught them, and their mothers taught them for 100 generations. The process is to extract the center of consciousness from the intellect and get it in the 4D world. Now, another function of mind is the rationale. The mind is the sequential thinker. And I say that just so that we'll know that, because the fourth feature of the mind that we talk about is the intuition. And intuition is really what Barbara calls the awareness faculty. And it's like the seventh sense, we could call it. It just depends on how you number senses. I think Margaret calls it the sixth sense. But it is that higher sense above the rational mind which can have the direct contact with the direct realization of God. And that experience is always a higher than non-verbal realization. It is an experience that, having had it, you know at a very deep level, at a level that is so much realer to you than the rational level, that you know that's truth. And even though you don't usually remain at that experience when you begin having them, nonetheless you trust that more than you trust the 3D experience. You certainly trust it more than the rational mind. The intuition is the contact with the 4D consciousness. The intuition is the source of truth. The intuition is it's the channel, if you will. It's like the funnel, and it's like the funnel part of the funnel that I drew 3 or 4 weeks ago, or 6 weeks ago, or whenever it was. And it is the contact, and it really bypasses the intellect and directly impacts the mind. Now, when the consciousness is centered around the intuition, then the 4D consciousness is the content of consciousness, and that's what's impacting the mind, and that's what's your reality. When the consciousness is in the intellect, when it's housed in the intellect, in the rational process and such like, then it's hearing all the folklore and the lies and the duality and all that stuff that is the nature of the intellect, and that's what you're experiencing. There's a couple of other things. The intuition is also the interpreter of the forms. The mind, the consciousness creates, the mind forms, the intuition interprets. So it really has 3 functions now. And we'll get into that more as the evening goes on. Margaret touches on that in a few places. But what it boils down, and we'll get into it especially when we get into supply, but what it boils down to is, if I am intuitively in contact with God, and that is impacting my mind. Now, that is all spiritual, and it is God concepts, and it's got nothing to do with matter and 3D stuff. And that is what is expressed out into the world, and then I see it. And the seer is this conditioned mind which sees it according to the framework that I live in. It's very interesting that the very high saints, if they're Catholics, have the experience of seeing Mary. And if they're Hindu, they see Ramakrishna. And if they're Christian, they see Jesus. And what they're seeing is what they expect to see. And that's the intellect interpreting the experience, which is God consciousness. God full on right there in front of them. So at the very high, the reason I chose that example is that at the very highest of consciousness, which is still wearing a body, still the intellect is the interpreter. At a more mundane level, if you're having a good experience of supply and you need a house, I'll get a house that agrees with what I think a house should be, and somebody in China will get a house that's entirely different. I mean, the form agrees with the conditioning, and it meets our requirements. So the intellect is the one that is least obvious, and the real reason for that is that there really still are 3 functions there. We really ought to use interpreter and storehouse and rationalizer or something like that to refer about these, but I'm going to stay with Margaret's terminology because, as I say, we're going to spend a lot of time reading the class she taught on the mind. She is so clear, and she has this stuff so sorted out that it just blew me away when I heard her tape. It's just wonderful. I'm going to go to spend some time in a class with her in the end of April after this class is over. So, are we all together? Is everybody? Yes.
Well, did I hear you say that the intuition interprets?
No, intellect interprets.
Okay.
The intuition is the direct God. I may have used the wrong word. Okay, cool. Keep me honest.
Yes.
No, the intellect interprets. The intuition is the awareness faculty, and what it's aware of is God consciousness. The intuition is the subject of the awareness exercise, and of course the purpose is to expand our intuition or our awareness, and therefore expand the amount of God that's in our life and the amount of God that's impacting our mind. One other thing I might mention is that reading Joel's books, for example, and listening to Joel tapes and such like is, why does that work? What's the purpose in doing that? What we're doing is we're retraining the intellect. We're retraining it, and this serves two purposes. We retrain it so that when the consciousness is in the intellect, nonetheless the experience is better. And we're also retraining it so that the interpretive function that it performs is a better interpretive function. So one of the reasons that we do this reading and tape listening is to retrain the intellect. The other reason is that in the process of doing that, we can then use this new information to elevate us, so that the intuition is functioning and we make the God contact. So it really serves two purposes. So when I listened to this tape of Margaret's, it was funny. She commented at the start that many of the people that were in her class had heard this material 20 years ago, and I think she was in fact reading from notes that she delivered in a class that she gave 20 years earlier. And she commented, sort of laughing, and she said, "But you're all newcomers, none of them got it then," and she laughed about the fact that the previous time that she'd read it, none of them got it. And then she proceeded to go through that, and I went through it 10 minutes at a time, and stopped and meditated and wrote it down and sorted it, and then listened a little more. So I don't know if the rest of her class got that in that hour that she presented. I don't know whether they got it that hour or not, but the reason I wrote it down instead of playing the tape for you is I want to be able to stop paragraph by paragraph and look around and make sure that people are hearing it and that we're all together. And so ask questions, stop, interrupt, make sure it's clear. She says, mind is the infinite instrument of consciousness. The first principle is I am consciousness, I am spirit, mind is my instrument to reflect back to me that which I am. Now see, she said it differently than I've said it. It reflects back the content of consciousness, but consciousness is what I am. And this is the I am in the sense that God is, but this is also where I'm at if I'm in the intellect. What is the mind, she says? You are looking at it. What we call space is mind. Everything you see is an image in mind formed by mind. Space is defined by form. In the infinite invisible space I conceptualize myself and create an image of myself, and the mind is compelled to mirror that back to me. It does not create. I conceptualize a world based on two powers and put that into my mind, and it is reflected back to me. She says space is mind, and I commented earlier when she's talking about it, she talks about having her grandchildren with her and talking to them about what you're looking at out here is mind. And I think of it slightly differently. I don't think that out there is mind. I think that out there is in here is mind. So it's a conceptual thing. I don't think mind is space. I think space is just one other thing in mind. But we're just saying things differently. It has, I mean, those two statements are equivalent. Mind is space, or space is in mind, or whatever. But the point is that all of space, all of everything that we see, and all of time is in mind. Intellect is an adjunct of mind. The intellect is a storehouse, a repository of all our human experiences. It's the bugaboo to fourth dimensional consciousness. It too cannot create. It is that reasoning faculty which keeps throwing up the reasons why spiritual truth cannot be accepted into the mind. It's not the mind which is holding us in humanhood. There's no conflict in my mind and your mind. Mind is an unconditioned avenue of awareness and is used by consciousness for the purpose of manifesting or forming itself, consciousness, and forming that consciousness infinitely. I don't have to transcend my mind. I am transcendent of my mind. The mind is in me. So that's a thought that we're always thinking about. We need to transcend our mind, but we don't need to transcend our mind. We need to retrain our intellect, and we need to open our awareness. It is the intellect, an adjunct of mind, which receives impressions and judges according to its memory of past experiences acquired through the five senses. The intellect is a storehouse of human experience and academic learning. Its judgments are better known as common sense. She points out that in senility, it's the intellect that is shut down. Mind is still working, the pictures are still there. When someone is senile, it's the intellect that is shut down, and that gives you one more clue about what the difference is between the two. Intuition is the sixth sense, or seventh if you're listening to Barbara. We turn to it to perceive true wisdom. God's truth is not reasonable. The well-developed intellect is the strongest barrier to the kingdom of God. That's an important point. I mean, God's truth is not reasonable. All the good things in AA are paradoxical. All the truths, spiritual truths, are paradoxical. It's not reasonable. And the mind, I mean, it makes no sense to give to get, to give it away to keep it, to when we get the supply. I mean, the answer is, you want more love, love more. You want more supply, give more. You know, on and on. I mean, it's all backwards. It's all unreasonable, and the intellect will rebel against this and say, no, that's nonsense, and keep you here. The intellect will tell us that we need to operate from fear instead of love. The intellect will tell us that the wise course is, self-preservation instead of laying down your life for someone else. It's very interesting just how unreasonable spiritual truth is.
Would you read that last sentence again? Yeah. I want to make a comment about it, but I want to say...
Intuition is the sixth sense. We turn to it to perceive true wisdom. God's truth is not reasonable. A well-developed intellect is the strongest barrier to the kingdom of God.
And yet, you and I have discussed this before. I think we talked about Rashneesh, and he is a very intelligent, brilliant man with a high developed intellect, and yet enlightened at the same time. And that's where I get a little bit confused. You can have both, right?
Oh, yes. Yeah, Ramesh Balasakar talks about the working mind. And Robert has a wonderful mind and a wonderful sense of humor. The first thing about a Rajneesh, an enlightened person, is Rajneesh doesn't think and reason things out and decide what to do. Thoughts happen in Rajneesh spontaneously. When he talked an hour and a half every day without notes. The talk just flowed. Now, the talk was totally spontaneous. There was no rehearsal, no plan. It was being drawn out by the crowd that was there, the consciousness that was there. The requirements determined what was said. It was the words that were chosen were based on the content of the intellect, his vast knowledge of spiritual works and things, because he taught at universities and he had this huge knowledge and this huge IQ, and so there was all this information that was in there. And this was the information that's in the intellect. Now, this is another case of supply. Now, he's totally open in the intuition. He's got the flow of supply, and in this case the supply is the class, is the lecture. The supply is coming through, and it is being interpreted by his intellect and by ours, the class that was there. And it was the content of his intellect that allowed it to be so wonderful and delicious. And it's also his intellect that determined that he's telling dirty jokes instead of parables. And because that was the way he was communicating with people. And so there's no conflict between the intellect. The problem is that when you use the intellect for anything other than phone numbers, addresses, and data retrieval. I mean, the problem is when you use the intellect as a decision-making process about life, rather than solving algebra problems. And that's Ramesh's distinction about the working mind. The working mind is a very useful thing. We have to get home, we have to remember phone numbers, we have all sorts of things that we have to do, and while you're wearing a body, you need a working mind. Okay, the personal sense of I is most heavily fortressed in the intellect, the personal sense. This is the 3D I. The personal sense of I is most heavily fortressed in the intellect. This is the problem. This is where we live as human beings. This is where our I is. And we can't seem to transcend the intellect, to rise above it as a human being. Only in those rare times as a human being, when we are quiet, when we are still, and the intuitive faculty works, do we transcend the intellect. Becoming like a little child means transcending the intellect. That's a statement that Jesus said you have to become like a little child to enter the kingdom of God. Becoming like a little child means transcending the intellect. Then there is no reason, knowledge, or past experience to cause doubt or fear. Okay?
I have a question.
Sure.
When you're a little child, you actually do have everything in your intellect, for the most part, the repository part from all your lifetimes.
Right.
So why are children, if all that is there, is it because they haven't tapped into it yet? They're not conditioned to look into that? I mean, it's all there.
Yeah, but it's really subconscious at that point.
Because I'm trying to sense when that switch over happens, when all of a sudden you start paying attention to it. You move from the little child on.
I mean, I certainly don't have an answer for that. I have different and conflicting facts about it. It certainly has been true in a story Barbara tells that a baby was clearly into his conditioning, but usually they say that the child is mostly under his parents' consciousness and being governed by that through like the first 10 or 12 years. What's the number, Joel, here? 12 or 14 years that parents are the...
14.
Huh?
14.
14?
But after that, they're usually under their own consciousness.
We have to spend time reconditioning them and bringing it to the surface, I think, is what's going on there. But when he's talking about being like a little child, he's talking about the state of mind that's running after a butterfly. Or the state of mind that can have a tantrum right now and 1 minute later be running after a butterfly.
Teachable.
Open and unthinking. Nothing rational going on there, nothing sequential. Totally in the now. Totally open, totally spontaneous. Spontaneity is the key of Buddhahood. No thought. Okay, so it's only in those rare times as a human being when we are quiet, when we are still, and the intuitive faculty works, do we transcend the intellect. And that's what we have to transcend. Becoming like a little child means transcending the intellect. Then there's no reason, knowledge, or past experience to cause doubt or fear. Studying the letter of truth, listening to tapes, reading books, is the reconditioning of the intellect, over which I do have dominion. When that job is finished and the spirit of truth is established, then it takes over, and I no longer need to know the truth because I have a reborn intellect. My conscious...
Could you say that again?
Sure. Studying the letter of truth is the reconditioning of the intellect, over which I have dominion. When that job is finished, when I have reconditioned my intellect to know the correct letter of truth rather than the lie, and the spirit of truth is established, then it takes over, and I no longer need to know the truth. And she means by that I no longer need to recite it to myself, because I have a reborn intellect.
So it seems like we always kind of get it up here first.
Yes.
And then we start to have an
Except in
experience.
rare cases we reprogram. And as a result of reprogramming, we go higher and higher, and the transcendent experiences happen more and more frequently. And in the transcendent experiences, we get the knowledge that the information that we had reconditioned our mind with was true. I mean, while we're reconditioning it, it is still theoretical. But that's the process that slowly we get rid of the old ideas and we get the new ideas in more and more, and then the other information becomes more reasonable. My consciousness has been reborn of spirit, and that consciousness has retrained through its dominion the intellect and the mind. Now the pictures begin to change. The mind begins to reflect back to me something different than ordinary human consciousness. I have a more harmonious life. I am more prosperous. I don't have bad health anymore. Everything begins to change. Do you see that process? I retrain the intellect. That is an elevation of my consciousness. The mind reflects what's in my consciousness, and my world now reflects the higher truth that I know. And by the way, high truth is the reason it turns out to be more harmonious, more prosperous, better health and such, is that truth is harmonious. You can expect harmony. God is harmonious. That's one of the rules. God is harmony. You can expect harmony. To repent, which is a good Christian word, means literally to change your mind. Nobody can change their mind humanly. And we can't change the mind spiritually until we rise to the fourth dimensional consciousness. That's why, as human beings, the intellect keeps pouring the same old deals back into the mind. Human history keeps repeating itself, collectively and individually. And this is script too, by the way. Script is in here for you people that are doing the script class.
So it's not something you do, it's something that happens to you when you transcend up to the fourth dimension. Humbly
asked him to remove my shortcomings. I became entirely willing. Becoming, in the sixth step, becoming entirely willing to have my character defects removed is becoming aware accurately of the price I'm paying as a result of this defect, and becoming aware consciously of the price it's costing and the smallness of the payoff. And when I see all this, my intellect is retrained with respect to this. And then I can humbly ask that the defective character be removed, and in fact, now that I see this clearly, the intellect is no longer holding me locked into that lie, and it's possible to make that contact and to have that character defect removed, at least in that extent, at that level. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting connecting Barbara Mull's work on And she said that changing that mind, we can't take out the old, we just can't like remove the old, but what we have to do is re-record over. In other words, it's not like there's an erase button. It's more that you have to make that groove deeper over and over and over of the new truth over the old truth. And that was my experience in the 12 steps too, was I couldn't focus on getting rid of my defects. But what I would do is I would have my mind redirected to my asset side, and while I was regrouping my assets and really work, doing the right kinds of behavior and action, it seemed to regroove to where the defects would just sort of either disappear or become so much in the background that they weren't, But I couldn't like go in and rip out the old. It didn't seem to work that way. It seemed that I had to put so much good in, or not good, but the reverse behavior in, that it would wash out the old and regroove that mind. That's why Barbara gives us out loud. She believes, and I'm experiencing it now, that by saying it out loud in the morning, she gave us sentences to say every single day, like, God is my consciousness, nothing but the truth can enter my mind, my body, or my environment. And to say that, and she said out loud over and over and over, it grooves, and and so we'll see. I'm doing it's different too, so I don't want to do it out loud. I like to sing. And she says, well, that's not my experience. My experience is to deepen the groove in the brain, and it kind of records over the old.
Okay. It certainly is true that we need to reiteratively reprogram. That's, my experience is that it's important to do that reading every morning and every evening, and that you can't do a lot. Do a little every day, and that's as much as you can do, and you build it up. I mean, it took a lot of lifetimes, in fact, and certainly a lot of conditioning this lifetime to build these truths, and they need to be deprogrammed, exactly as I was talking about. Okay, the state of being beyond words and thoughts, the void or the vacuum, is that state which is created in the childlike trust as entry for spiritual consciousness. Say that one again, that's the process. The state of being beyond words and thoughts, the void, the vacuum, or in the silence, we say, is that state which is created in the childlike trust as an entry for spiritual consciousness. And I would add, as an entry into as an entry for spiritual consciousness into the 3D picture from the 4D consciousness. What that's saying is that when we're in the silence, when the intellect is shut down and the intuitive faculty is functioning, then the channel is open, which allows the fourth dimensional truth to impact the three-dimensional mind.
Into the three-dimensional picture from four-dimensional...
From the four-dimensional consciousness. That's what we were saying earlier, that when you are in the silence, in the intuitive awareness, then it can directly impact the mind. Without that void, spiritual consciousness cannot enter, cannot impress itself on the mind, cannot eradicate the human concepts that we see reflected back to us.
This is open-mindedness?
No, this is meditation. Mind is not open. Mind is just a reflector. This is a quiet intellect. This is a shut-down intellect. We're trying to get rid of the reasoning, which she says is the bugoo. The reasoning which says that's not reasonable. The mind as an avenue of awareness, and I don't think mind is the right word, I'll read the sentence. The mind as an avenue of awareness interprets the 4D entry as an extraordinary experience. The beyond words and thought experience, because it is beyond the intellect. the point is that that experience is extraordinary, and the intellect can't grope with it. And well, let me just keep reading, and then we can all try to think what we would like to say instead of that. The mind doesn't interpret it. Eventually, what we see gets interpreted again by the intellect based on our experience. It's just the rational parent type faculty is cut down. The mind as an avenue of awareness interprets this 4D entry as an extraordinary experience, this beyond words and thought experience, because it is beyond the intellect. We have nothing humanly to relate to it. In fact, we cannot even bring it into the intellect sufficiently to describe it, because there is no human language with which to describe it. It transcends human consciousness, which means it has a language of its own which is received in the silence. As the input of that consciousness, that awareness of the fourth dimension strikes the mind, the mind, reflects back more of the true reality of that which the 4D is. But that cannot be described. It can only be experienced. It cannot be explained. It must be experienced, and in order to experience it, we must create this vacuum, this void, this silence, through the continuous filling of our mind and intellect with truth, until eventually that void is created and the full impact of fourth dimensional consciousness can flow through. And it seems to change the picture. Now that's...
So, when the fourth dimension strikes the mind, and the mind reflects back the fourth dimension consciousness, does the intellect play any part in that, or is the intellect like sleeping?
Intellect is quiet in the sense that it's not preventing that flow, and it's not trying to interpret it, and it's not trying to put words on it, and it's not trying to say that's not reasonable. The experience is so extraordinary that the intellect can't relate. It doesn't relate to its database. But still, it is the intellect which interprets it and sees Mary instead of Jesus, or Ramakrishna instead of Mary, or whatever. So in that sense, there is an interpreter there, but that's why I want to use different words, really. That's why it gets a little confusing using the intellect. The interpreter is still there, but the storehouse and that faculty that we're talking about, that the 3D intellect 3D consciousness lives in, is not there. Steve?
Yeah, I think just kind of address that. Just get this. I think last week you talked about bypassing the intellect. Mm-hmm. Yet at the same time, I'm hearing a retraining of the intellect also, like the proper use of the intellect.
Two separate processes. When you are in the silence, in transcendental consciousness, it's just a flat bypass, and it doesn't matter at this point what the content of the intellect is, because there is no content. The intellect is shut down. Now, retraining the intellect, introducing truth into the intellect, will increase your likelihood of getting into this state of transcendental consciousness.
So we're like approaching from...
Mm-hmm. We have to lift ourselves to the state of intellectual consciousness, and we will not get there as long as our mind is saying that's nonsense. Don't meditate. Don't go to class. You're tired, the intellect will come up with 100 reasons why this is an impractical path to follow. We must retrain the intellect and come to the point where we have some discipline and do our spiritual practices, although they're clearly nonsense. And it's like working the seemingly unrelated steps. Clearly nonsense. This is not my problem. These steps cannot help. My problem is my wife. We must retrain the intellect to where it is silent enough to allow that. I also comment often at AA that the reason the 11th step is 11th is that you're not going to get silent enough to meditate until you've done the first 9 and have cleaned out the wreckage of the past and cleared the house. And how can you get quiet if you haven't cleaned house?
Yes. On the intellect again, I feel like you go through your meditation in silence and you transcend, but then when you come out of your silence, you need the awareness to get you through the day.
And this type of awareness is the fourth dimension. You need an intellect to have that awareness.
No. The awareness is awareness.
So they're separate.
Mm-hmm.
Separate.
Yeah, it's a separate faculty. The awareness is a separate faculty from the intellect. Jesus or Joel or someone of that height was in the world but not of it. And that means to me that they're walking through the world in the fourth dimensional consciousness, in the state of awareness, with no rational processes going on in their head at all. The only thoughts are spontaneous. They are as a result of the need to express something. And when Jesus said a sentence, that was the first time he'd heard that sentence, as well as the person he was speaking to hearing it for the first time. And when he needed a phone number, the intellect when the spontaneous need for a phone number showed up, although Jesus probably didn't have a lot of demand for phone numbers. An address, let's say, when you needed an address, when the spontaneous need for an address occurred, the intellect would spontaneously cough up the address because it's stored in there, and the intellect also serves as a data storage.
I guess the process to get to the awareness could be the intellect used in a good way. The process to get to the awareness.
It is, and that's why we retrain it, in order to elevate ourselves. Yes, that's what the contemplative meditation is about that Joel recommends as a process to getting silent. Using truth to elevate the consciousness, to elevate the intellect, to retrain the intellect and elevate the consciousness to where you can get into the silence is what the purpose of the contemplative meditation is about.
So the fact that thoughts are there does not mean that the intellect is kicked in. Or does it? Because the intellect is the interpreter of...
It depends on what you mean by thoughts.
Well, for example,
the intellect is... Einstein says that God gave him the theory of relativity. He didn't have the answer. There's no way he's going to get it. It's not deducible, such like. He gets silent. He gets this extraordinary experience which comes in, and then the intellect, in a rational process, retrofits it with words.
right.
Or Rajneesh said, I have this experience, this extraordinary experience. He said, I had this experience. He said, and while I was there, it was all silence, and there was no communication. He said, and then I came back, and he said, and 99% of it was lost. And then I chose to put it into words, and 99% of that was lost. And then I selected the words to give to you, and 99% of that was lost. And then you heard them, interpreted them, and 99% of that was lost. And he said, but it was extraordinary enough that there is left a spark which may light a fire in you. But that's the intellect retrofitting. If it's a true transcendental knock your socks off experience, there are no words. The intellect is not going to retrofit that. But in other cases, like the E equals MC squared, there was math that could talk about it.
So it's a filter no matter, even if it's a transcendental vision or a completely erroneous vision, it's still...
Well, see, Rajneesh would have done fine if he hadn't tried to talk about it. Right? His problem was he was a teacher. The first loss was coming back, not being in it. I mean, to stop being in that experience was the primary loss, but everything else that was lost was just trying to express it. And that was trying to use the intellect, trying to use the rational process to express it. What was the next 399% going? Very often I'm talking with somebody and I discover myself saying something, and my reaction is, oh, I didn't know they were ready to hear that. I don't decide what I'm going to say ever when I'm talking with people, or edit it or censor it or decide they can or can't hear it. I don't write this stuff.
So in that instance, in that specific instance, when something comes through, your intellect is not involved.
Right.
Except to a minor degree to form words.
The word forming part, but that's the That's right.
It's not you, it's
That's
really
right.
God.
When you're thinking spontaneously, you're speaking spontaneously. That's all spontaneous, and there's no thought about it. Now, when I'm worried about what I'm going to say, that's a whole different process. Okay. What has truly happened is in that void, that vacuum, in that space where the intellect is not ruling the mind, for that moment, your I has transcended your intellect and it impacts your mind. And that we call repentance or a changing of the mind or a healing. Actually, nothing has been healed. It was just a picture, but your changed mind is reflecting back a better picture. Are we seeing how supply and healing is all going to fall right out of this? I mean, we're going to spend time on them because they're such neat subjects and they're worth going over the details of, but it's just all right here. The intellect is that which is erroneously called the human, carnal, or mortal mind. It is the intellect which gives us difficulty and opposes clear understanding. The mind is an infinite instrument of invisible substance which forms images conceived by the I, wherever it, the I, may be residing in consciousness, i.e. in the fourth dimensional or in the intellect. The intellect is a reservoir of human belief and concepts formed to accommodate the false sense of I, which has lost sight of its oneness and origin with the source.
Can you read that sentence again?
You bet. I don't know how she got through this class reading it once. Do you see what I mean about I was stopping and backing up the tape and going forward? And it's so sequential. She's got such a beautiful intellect. She's so intuitive. The intellect is that which is erroneously called the human, carnal, or mortal mind. It is the intellect which gives us difficulty and opposes clear understanding. The mind is an infinite instrument of invisible substance which forms images conceived by the I wherever it may be residing in consciousness. The intellect is a reservoir of human belief and concepts formed to accommodate the false sense of I, which has lost sight of its oneness and origin with the source. Now here, the real spiritual I does not need the intellect or the mind. The mind is created by the spiritual I as an... I'll turn that off. The mind is created by the spiritual I as an instrument to reflect back to itself that which it is. Consciousness itself is all and needs no help, no picture, no nothing. But it's like humans with mirrors so we can see ourselves. So when you're in the true spiritual I, we just have the mind forming whatever is there, and we have back it off. Okay. In other words, as human beings, we look to our intellect as our source, not God, and receive over and over the same suggestions, the same beliefs, and the same false information regarding good and evil. This is another place where you might connect with your script. We manifest this misinformation through the mind, and we believe it. All our faith and trust is in it. Let's think of consciousness as the invisible individual I, the spirit which I am. The mind has no capacity to think or create, and neither does the intellect. I think, I create. The mind is an unconditioned, unintelligent substance like dough. Anything that I think I create, the mind has to form. It's my instrument. I am responsible for what I put into it and what I reject. I have dominion over it. And here again, the dominion, what I put into it and what I reject, when we're not in the transcendental state of consciousness and letting the fourth D consciousness directly impact it, we are exerting our dominion over it by what we believe and what we let come into our mind and what we don't. And here again is the reconditioning, and here also is the protective work, the denying, listening to the news and laughing at it, or not choosing not to listen to the news, choosing not to listen to the lies, choosing what things we do and don't read. We have a lot of dominion over what information we do and don't put in our mind. Who we hang out with, what classes we go to, all of that is determining the content of our intellect and therefore our experience. So if we're wise, we accept an obligation to exercise as much dominion as we can at this moment over our mind, over our intellect. And we do have dominion. And that is what protective work is about. It is asserting dominion. I will put truth in my mind rather than letting the subliminal human carnal mind infiltrate my mind with these lies about sickness and disease and such like.
Cool way to look at that too is if you're being like a little child and think about all the discretion people use with little children about what they watch, and if we're being like that, you at least want to do that to yourself as well.
Mind is a vast substance filling all of space, or containing all of space, that we use to create our world, to become aware of a spiritual world, an avenue of awareness through which intuition functions. The stinking thinking from the intellect is the problem. Her words. It's a vast mirror reflecting to the individual only that which he can conceive. The mind is a dough into which we impress our concepts of ourselves. It is used by individuals at all levels of consciousness. These impressions on the mind appear as body, structure, materials, and other forms of infinite variety. The five senses, in fact, are conceptualized extensions of inner faculties. We speak of hearing with the inner ear or seeing with the inner eye. They're extensions of spiritual ideas which are useful in the human experience. They are also an appearance in mind, concepts of limited capacity, concepts in the mind. This is not our real body, our spiritual body. This is a concept of body which the mind is reflecting back to us. So always keep in mind here, keep in mind that when we're talking about this, this body, we tend to think that the mind is in the body and these images are in the mind, or the mind is in the brain, is in the body. But see, the body is being produced by the mind. The brain is being produced by the mind. The space is being produced by the mind. Everything that you have a concept about, a material concept about, or everything which comes to you through the five senses is formed by the mind. Mind is matter. Mind is creating it. Everything that you can conceive of, have a concept of, is formed by the mind. And it is your mind and your consciousness that is forming what you're seeing.
But that hooks in with others. For instance, if we all look at that plant right there and form that plant, I'm assuming, well, maybe I'm not, maybe we don't all see the same plant. I guess I don't know that.
Yeah. How do you tell?
Yeah, there's about four things that go on there, and I think we'll do that one, and then we'll stop for tonight. First of all, what makes you think there's anybody else here in the room? Second of all, what makes you think what you call purple isn't what I see as chartreuse? I mean, you'd have to get in my mind to see what my experience is for that color. We've agreed on the labels, but we have no way of ever knowing if the experience is the same unless we get into each other's minds. I think we're going to do another week of this. This stuff is really good stuff, I think, and I think we'll do another week of this. And there is a reality, and very much in quotes, but there is, if all of us had our intellect out of the way and were an open conduit to the fourth dimensional consciousness, and if we were all aware of our oneness with each other, we would still see something. And that would be a reflection of God's concept. I mean, God is the creative consciousness. God is our consciousness. God has the idea that is the human being, although the structure here that we see is our concept of that. But there is an underlying concept. There is an underlying creation.
So would we all see the same thing then?
If there was no we, if we were all one, we would all see the same thing, but we would see something. So that's the real answer you were trying to get to. We would see something. As long as we're wearing these bodies. Of course, if we were at that state, we wouldn't be wearing bodies, but there is something there. I mean, there is, and there are things we see that are changeable, and through repentance, through changing our mind, there are things that are changeable, and there are things that we do not have the ability as human beings to change. And you're not going to move Pluto out of its path. There are things that are not generated by the local human mind, and there are things that are generated by your local human mind, and the things that you're generating you can change. And in fact, the things that you're generating can be changed by a practitioner through elevating your consciousness to where you see it better. And there seems to be something going on that we all essentially have responsibility for our own bodies. My body is mostly my concept of myself, although each of you, if you were to get together and discuss what my body looks like, would all have, or who I am, you would all have a different opinion, so you guys are reinterpreting that. But in some sense, I'm driving there. Very definitely all interrelated. So I'll reread that last paragraph. Now, 2 more paragraphs, then we'll stop. Mind is a vast substance filling all of space that we use to create our world, to become aware of a spiritual world. It's the spiritual world that we're becoming aware of, and that's real. Okay? The spiritual world is real. It's an avenue of awareness through which intuition functions. This thinking from the intellect is the problem. The mind is a vast mirror reflecting back to the individual only that which he can conceive. It's limited, your experience is limited by your ability to conceive. It is used by individuals at all levels of consciousness. It's indiscriminatory. These impressions on the mind appear as body, structure, materials, and other forms of infinite variety. The 5 senses, in fact, are conceptualized extensions of inner faculties. We speak of hearing with the inner ear, seeing with the inner eye, etc. They're extensions of spiritual ideas which are useful in the human experience. They are also an appearance in mind, concepts of limited capacity, concepts in mind. This is not our real body, our spiritual body. This is our concept of body, which mind is reflecting back to us. But I govern. I can speak into my mind from my infinite spiritual capacity. I can tell it to peace, be still. And when I do that and feel the inner response, the inner release of pure spiritual substance, the picture changes. Personally, I cannot give peace to anything. It is only from the heights of spiritual awareness, that faith, that inner trust, that conviction, that I can close my eyes and from that height transcend the intellect, lifting my eye up out of the intellect, knowing that I am speaking into the mind, peace. And then you get your release and something happens in your mind.
Yeah, that's the part of that. I govern my inner body.
But I govern. I can speak into my mind from my infinite spiritual capacity. I can tell it to peace, be still. And when I do that and feel the inner response, the inner release of pure spiritual substance, the picture changes. That's the core of it. Personally, I cannot give peace to anything. Personally, the limited sense of I, the personal I. It is only from the height of spiritual awareness, that faith, that inner trust, that conviction, that I can close my eyes and from that height transcend the intellect, lifting my eye up out of the intellect, out of the personal sense, knowing that I am speaking into the mind, peace. And then you get the release and something happens in the mind. Supply or healing or peace. And I think that's a good place to stop. I will go over this and select enough out of this next week that we finish next week, because obviously we can spend a lifetime here. Yes, I will give everybody copies of this, don't worry. Yes, that's why I transcribed it for myself, but this will definitely be a handout, but I want to do it this way first, and when we're done, I'll give it to you.
Okay.
Let's don't all go off by ourselves and decide independently what we think this means. Let's do it together in consciousness, and then take that and study it for a lifetime. Recognition exercises. We're on number 5 this week. Last week we did, I recognized that the hypnotized person cannot dehypnotize himself, but that God consciousness can and will do that if contacted. God could and would if he were sought. Do you dig the dehypnotization being the way to sobriety? Are we connecting these steps with the ABCs? Okay, 5 is I recognize that the conscious resting in the presence of God lifts the hypnosis and sets me free. And that's what we've been talking about tonight. When I am consciously in the presence of God, in that intuitive oneness with God, it impacts the mind. The picture changes. The hypnosis is lifted. I see a picture which more correctly reflects the truth. More correctly reflects God's idea. I like to think of it as the real stuff being God's idea and the unreal stuff being my idea. Okay? I mean, God is the author of this whole thing, and there is God's idea. And so I recognize that the conscious resting in the presence of God lifts the hypnosis and sets me free. God could and would if he were sought. If you believe this stuff, you begin to think that the program of Alcoholics Anonymous might work. Amazing how accurate he was in areas. Anything else? Let's get quiet for 4 or 5 minutes and see if anything got left out.